Christopher Columbus is, if you watch the news at all, Christopher Columbus has taken quite a beating lately. For one, in the very northeastern side of the United States and in the eastern part of Canada, people have discovered that there were probably Vikings or Nords, as they call them, in North America around like 900 to 1000 AD. And so people are like, well, Columbus wasn't the first one here. He's not so important. And then on the other side, you have kind of the cancel culture deciding that he was kind of the start of something really bad with all the, you understand, cancel culture is trying to destroy Christopher Columbus for the ruin brought upon Native Americans. But why Columbus endures and why he was ever so important was not because he was the first person here, and it's not because he was ever at all some kind of great philanthropist. Just wasn't that person. Here's what happened. Here's why Columbus was so important. By the time you get to about the 1450s, the Muslims, called the Moors, the Islam, was pushing into southern Europe. And they were getting conquered at a pretty good rate in the 1400s. It was this pressing. In the eastern part of the empire, in Asia, where Russia is, that empire was starting to build. It had nothing to do with Europe. And it was pressing into Europe. So Europe feels like it's getting squished. And their imaginations for almost 1,000 years was pressed that they had already reached the ends of the earth. That was it. They were looking at extinction in some sense. So Columbus decides with Spain that he's going to take this, and it's looked like a foolish voyage. He's going to take this foolish chance and sail across the sea, looking to see if there's a way across. And he puts himself out there to be pretty vulnerable, because if nothing happens, he never returns. Guess what? His name's a fool. He looks like a moron pretty much. But the moment he returns from North America, even if he didn't know exactly where it was at the time, the moment he returns from North America, Europe explodes like an earth-shaking event had happened. People's imaginations went wild at the possibilities. Everyone across Europe was deciding they could start taking risks. The Renaissance explodes. It's not another 20 years, and you have the Reformation. What allows for the growth of the Reformation? People can actually get out of Europe, have somewhere to go. It expanded people's minds in this huge... The myth that the earth was flat, gone. The myth that the ocean dropped off at the edge, or that even if you just went over to China, gone in just a decade or so. The myths of the world were all gone. Everyone's going, we thought we knew everything, and we don't have it figured out. New possibilities, adventures start. So he's not famous because he made it here first, but because his announcement of the good news, that changed everything. It really changed the world. I'd say there are only a few epoch-shifting moments in all of history like this, so rapidly changing accepted truths and defying old myths. And Christmas is critical because of the good news of God. It created new possibilities. It destroyed old myths because we thought we knew who God was until Jesus came and really, really demonstrates who God really is. So between Christmas and Easter, the world has just shook, and it's never been the same since. That's why Christmas is such an important time. It destroyed that old world. It destroyed our own myths about ourselves. I know a lot of times, and I've done it myself, we like to spend some time demythologizing Christmas. Here are some things you thought Christmas was about Christmas, and that's not true. That's not really Christmas. It's not really on December 25th, and we like to spend a lot of time demythologizing Christmas stories, and you have liberal people who demythologize, oh, that's a miracle, it couldn't have happened, and they want to demythologize Christmas. And I thought, this year, we really need to spend some time letting Christmas demythologize us. We need to let Christmas tell us what are our lies, what are our myths that we tell ourselves about ourselves or about God that really change our lives. So we're going to look at several stories this Christmas about when the angels came and spoke to different people, the shepherds, Mary, Joseph, and today, Zacharias, where they came to tell the good news and myths were destroyed and a new world's created. So what we see here in the story of Zacharias is Christmas truth reveals our myths. We'll talk about some myths. There were so many, like I said in the other part, there were so many myths, like the ocean dropping off the edge of the world, or they kept, when you believe that the world is that way, what do? You keep your ships close to the land. You don't get your ship so far away from land that you can't see it. You're keeping truth hidden. These myths keep truth hidden. In the story of Zechariah and Elizabeth, we see how myths about God, others, and ourselves leave us unprepared for what God wants to do in our lives. Now, there are a lot of social myths that I could talk about, but what I want to talk about this morning is our personal myths about ourselves that keep us from being prepared to receive the Lord, keep us unprepared to have an incredible encounter with God, and keep us unprepared for His second coming, pretty much. Our personal myths are things that we tell ourselves about ourselves. Okay? These are things that you tell yourself about yourself. There's a whole list of them. We're going to talk about Zechariah's and Elizabeth's. Zechariah's myth is that he's less important than someone half his age. He's unfit. It's a myth he's told himself. And because he thinks that so strongly, he's unprepared for what angel's going to say. What's funny about this is that Zechariah's name actually, it means God has remembered. But in this story, it seems that God, he thinks, and Elizabeth they feel neglected. They feel forgotten, disgraced. You see that? There's a bit of an irony here. Here's the moment. God has finally remembered them, and he's like, you must have the wrong guy. That ain't me. It must be somebody different. This is not how the story is supposed to go. When you say that to yourself, when you say that to the Lord, what it reveals is that you've told yourself some kind of myth. When God's calling doesn't match the story we tell ourselves, we shut down. We go, that can't be me. That's not for me. Gabriel punishes him with muteness for 9 months. And also, if you look in verse 62 and a little bit later, he also is deaf. They have to write on a board to ask him a question. He seems like he must also be deaf. But Gabriel punishes him, and his muteness, it turns out to be a sign of disgrace for one so chosen to be a priest in the temple. A temple person is supposed to be pure. In other words, you go in there to get grace, to receive something from the Lord, His presence, His power, to make a sacrifice and have this incredible exchange, and yet he comes out with less. And you go, how does this happen to a priest, right? He should have known the story of Abraham and Sarah. Remember what happened to Sarah? She laughed. And the angel rebuked Sarah. Or the beauty of the story of Hannah and Samuel. He's read these stories like us. He knows these stories like many of us. Yet it can't be me. That's not my story. That's not how this works. That's not how I saw my story going. And what you find is that myths lead to dysfunction and faithless doubt when you encounter the truth. Because you've told yourself so many lies, you can't even imagine something so incredible that the Lord can do in your life. Zacharias stands in the holiest place in the world and is doubtful when God says, I choose you. When the angel says, God chooses you. He goes, me? Not me. It can't possibly be me. No, he says, you're part of the avenue for preparing the world for Jesus. God chooses you. I choose you, he says to us. I choose you to go and tell people about Jesus and prepare their hearts to meet the Lord, either when they die or when the Lord comes back again. He says, I choose you. He says that at the end. I've chosen everyone. A disciple's job is to go out and tell the world about Jesus. Spread the good news. And he says, I choose you, and I've gifted you, and I've given what you need. And if you can't hear that, and you go, it's not me, then you're deaf, mute, like Zacharias. You've turned away because you have a myth in your life somewhere that says, it can't be me. I'm not that good. I'm too old. I'm not ready. And God says, I choose you, though. He chooses you, each of you. Christmas is this time where he is breaking the myths that you've told yourself. That you're not someone he would choose to go out to the world and tell them about him. He chooses you. Elizabeth also seems to have a myth. This is a myth I think I know of a lot of ladies who deal with this myth. The myth of rejection and disgrace. There's a lot of men who believe this as well. Not want to limit it, but I've read and find this one a lot. In the ancient world, it was the ultimate sign of a blessing for a woman to have children. There could be a lot of reasons people feel disgrace, but for her, this is it. When you look at her praise, she says this at the very end of what I read. The Lord took away my disgrace among men. If you understand how disgrace and favor, and the Lord's favored me and has taken away my disgrace, what's there is that she seems to have felt a disgrace from the Lord that other people recognized. She had this myth that she had somehow, some reason, had disgrace. In other words, done something likely that made her or her family had done something that left her barren. She was under this myth that she couldn't receive this blessing. She was disgraced. Now, again, it's not just about men's opinion. But likely here, she imagines she's rejected as a fit mother. That's probably the best way to say it. Rejected as a fit mother by the Lord. But it was a myth. It just wasn't time. It tells you how much she struggled with a sense of rejection in the circles of men and women around her. A sense that the Lord didn't bless her quite like he'd blessed other people. Like those people, Lord loves them more than he loves me, apparently, because they have more of this or more of that. They've had an easier life, or it seems a more fulfilled life. We derive these myths about ourselves from all kinds of different places. Early memories, how welcome we've felt at church, at home, at school, at work. What people say must be happening in our culture. Could do with gender, names, your nicknames that you were given as a young child seem to have a dramatic effect upon people, actually. I could keep going for how you were disciplined, how your parents treated you, but also how your parents related to one another. All of these play into the myths about how you think you fit into this world. And I realized some time ago that one of my myths was called soul responsibility. Not soul like my soul inside of me, but like only soul responsibility, which means that somewhere along the way, I thought that if I wasn't responsible for everything, then everything would fall apart. It's a little confession moment. This is years ago. I came across this and realized this is me. For me, when things, if I don't have some control or some oversight over something, it makes me feel panicked. For other people, it looks like a control freak if I'm not careful. You see, what it really means, I didn't trust the Lord to take care of things through other people. And I had to come to that realization to just let other people do what they're called to do. Because what happens with this myth is not so much like it affects me, but it also overfunctions. It makes me want to overfunction, do other people's calling for them. And what happens is if I'm overfunctioning, someone else is underfunctioning. They're not being able to use their gifts God gave them to prepare their hearts and their way and their lives to be servants of the Lord. Edward Wimberly, a famous counselor theologian, includes these things as well. The good girl, the knight in shining armor who always thinks they have to come in and save the day in the last moment and be a hero. The invulnerable man who thinks it's dangerous and weak to show vulnerability. The myth of the loner who always feels, I know there's an advertisement, a loner's got to be alone. No, they don't. A loner oftentimes is a person who feels that they are in the way or that others are insincere. And these are myths. There's the perpetual victim. And the perpetual victim often comes across as a person intentionally being a victim to get what they want, when actually it's a myth they tell themselves that they're always being hurt. There's the anchor person, a person who thinks that they're in your family, or maybe it's you, who's in the family who thinks if they don't make everybody get along, that the world's their family, their relationships are going to fall apart. So they're the constant glue. And anytime you can see when they think two people are coming together and they're going to maybe don't get along so well, they'll find their way right over to that relationship and put themselves in there and kind of referee it and make sure it goes smooth. They don't let those two function like they need to function. Each of these keeps us from reaching new adventures and new journeys in life. There's a lot more that we could get into. You know, I would ask this. If I were to say, what is the story of your life? There would be themes that we could pull out. Some of them are great themes. Some things you can tell about yourself are great things the Lord has done for you or whatever. But we all have certain myths. What are the myths that master you and keep you from a deeper relationship with others and with the Lord? It takes some soul searching. What brings you, here's how to do it. Here's one way to do it. What kind of situations bring you anxiety and fear and doubt? Maybe shame. These are the areas you likely need to hear the good news of the Messiah. God knows your story. Here's the good news. There's a way out of your story. There's a way out of your myth. Because God invites you into His story. The good news frees us from our myths. I have a book on these certain myths if you ever want to borrow it and read it. And if you're that kind of person who really loves self-reflection, I can lend you that. But there's no point in researching what your myths are or what you're struggling with if you're not going to take the good news of Jesus and apply this to your life. Many years ago now, the great theologian Karl Barth reminded churches that every person in the whole New Testament is significant only in how they relate to Christ. Does that make sense? Every person you think of in the New Testament is directly or indirectly, somehow, it relates to the story of the kingdom of God in Jesus Christ. There's no way around it. This story might be the announcement of John's birth to Zechariah, but it's about preparing for Jesus' coming. And the same is true of each of us. Our significance, our purpose in life is directly related to the story of Jesus Christ. Everything significant about life, everything else, if it's not connected to Christ, is but dust. It is but ashes. It is blown about in the wind. Everything important and significant in your life has to do with the story and being a part of the story of Jesus Christ. All the myths that we tell ourselves about who we are, how the world works, can never account for the impossibility of God's grace and just how amazing He is to bring us into His glory. The myths you tell yourself will tell you that you're not good enough, or that God's too far, or that, anything. That you're responsible, not him, for me. Everything it shadows and says, you know what? Me and God are not, I can't be a part of that story. It's too big. Gabriel's announcement sounds so impossible that Zechariah wants guarantees before he goes about announcing God's plan and ending up looking like a fool. He's like, this isn't possible. That's too big for me. That's too much weight and glory in my own life. That's too much grace. That can't be for me. That's not possible. Here's where our myths really get us in trouble. We think we have to earn something from God and get some guarantees. Whether it's because you think you're not good enough to get up there, it's too great. Whether you think that you can earn your way up there, it's impossible that he could just give it to you. We want guarantees. We want to be born special. Because this kind of grace can't possibly be real and be true. It's for those special people. It's for those people who are born with extra talents. But God breaks the myth of perfection and worthlessness at once. He doesn't need perfection from you for you to be valuable in his kingdom. He doesn't need perfection from you for you to be a part of his story. Zechariah isn't in the story because Zechariah's perfect submission and faith. He was good and he abided by the law, but then he fails. What does that prove? It proves he doesn't need your perfection. He wants your obedience. He wants you to go along in his story. He wants you to have faith in him and not in you. And that's why I think he goes and makes him silent. Because Zechariah, his myth is shut. His mouth is shut. And he's not going to be able to perform his priestly duties. He's not going to be able to go and say, hey, God just spoke to me and did this amazing thing in me, because Zechariah doesn't get it yet. I think God wants Zechariah to understand the grace of God for these 9 months before he's able to speak again. Because when he speaks again, the moment he says his name is John, and then he erupts into several passages of praise, that's what he wanted to hear the first time. But his myth kept him from belief. It was never that for this couple, it was never that God didn't have a plan for them. It was the myth that they were disgraced so much that God's grace couldn't cover it. Let's demythile it. I want to explain kind of how this works. It's the idea that you need to be good to get God's gifts is really ingrained in our culture. It's ingrained, like I said, I'm going to demythologize Christmas. It's ingrained in most of our Christmas songs that are non-Christian. It's in there. It's in a very popular one, and I hope it's not being a humbug to demythologize this, but I hope it's the opposite of being a humbug. Like, yeah, that sounds great, but it's way better than that. The songs about Santa always say that he knows who's naughty or nice, and he brings gifts. And that determines whether or not you get a big gift, a small gift, or coal in your stocking, right? That means that Santa is really used by parents for behavioral modification. That's what it is. Act good, and Santa, or God, this is Santa, and it's supposed to be sort of like a Jesus figure, right? Saint Nick. And if you're good, he's going to bring all these gifts for you. I wonder why people think God works that way too. But Christmas is about Jesus. And Jesus breaks Christmas sometimes for us. Because whether you are good or bad, God sent his son, Jesus Christ, as a gift for you. It doesn't matter what you've done. It doesn't matter whether you've killed somebody or whether you've had a friend murdered. It doesn't matter whether you're on the receiving or the giving side of evil. God came and gave the gift of his Son for you. Jesus even says, I came to heal the sick, not the well. But we sing, get here, be good. Santa will bring you gifts. Christmas is not the greatest time to teach the lesson of the world. That's the world's lesson. Be good and you get some rewards and you get some gifts. The story of Jesus coming to make all people new again. That's the story of Christmas. The coming of Jesus is a grace which overcomes all disgrace, all sin, all pain, and all the myths the world tells you. When you feel beyond hope, God is sufficient. The barrenness of Israel to get a word from the Lord was when the Lord spoke again, pure joy and significance. It meant God still had a plan for them. That's what this means. They had felt barren, empty. God was not, you might say, in the temple, so to speak, at this time. He never came back. He left in Ezekiel. There's no sense of him fully coming back. They kept preparing for the Lord to come, and they felt barren. They didn't have a word from the Lord. They didn't feel his presence in Israel. They were barren. And when he comes and says, your wife who was barren is now going to have a child, it meant all Israel was going to hear from the Lord again. Do you see that? It's much bigger than just Zechariah and Elizabeth. He came and says, I have a plan for the world. I have a plan for my people. It reminds us that each of us without the Lord has a barrenness in our own heart, an emptiness, a feeling of lack of meaning. And without him, you have no significance. He is the significance of your life. It's not about how good you were. It's not about what you've accomplished. It's about knowing Jesus and being in his service. It's the only story that our lives are enriched with eternal purpose. This morning, I want you to let the Master rewrite your story. Let the Master rewrite your story. I don't know the stories you tell yourself about yourself. I don't know the stories that you tell yourself about who God is. Maybe you feel a great burden that the world needs you. Maybe you feel that it doesn't like you or want you. Maybe it feels like you're never going to be good enough. I don't know the stories you tell yourself. For some of you, maybe mortality is staring you with its cold, dark eyes, and you aren't quite sure if there's another side. Maybe you feel symptoms of consistently lost relationships that you constantly go through that are never your fault. You just have bad luck. Maybe that's your story. Maybe it seems God gave someone else more talent, more gifts. I don't know. But the magic of Christmas is that through Jesus, God can rewrite your story by inviting you into his story. The real beauty of this story, again, is that during his silence, Zechariah, you could tell in his praise that you can go read, it's like several verses down from this story. You go and read. Zechariah had gone back and he calls the words of the laws and the prophets. Apparently, when he went quiet, he went into the text. What did he do? I'm silent. The Lord has silenced me. So what did he do? He embedded himself in the story of the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament. He went back and he looked and he goes, how do I fit into the story? Let's look at these prophets. And let's look at these prophets. And he comes out at the end and goes, I am in the story. I am part of the story. I are part of this story. He has included you in what he's doing. And so whatever you think you're not valuable, whatever makes you feel worthless or rejected, or whatever makes you a little too cocky, all gets leveled out and feeling and knowing that you're valuable in Jesus Christ as a servant of the kingdom. The low are brought high, the high are brought low. It's an amazing to go. I encourage you to go back and read where Zechariah gives his praise to the Lord. And Zechariah said he got that voice back, he got it back. And I bet he never let those words quit rolling off the tongue about how great God's grace is. The call of Christmas is to discover or recover your calling in God's kingdom. This is the last little bit right here. The call of Christmas is that you need to either discover or recover the calling that Jesus has put on your life. When I go through really rough patches, and I've been through some, encouragement is helpful, but there's nothing like going back to the moment in my mind, to my call story, when I knew for sure that God had called me to do not just preaching, but to be a person who speaks His word, to be a person who shares His word. I go back to that calling and I say, yes, I'm called. Let's move forward. There's no other place I can go. Salvation and my calling. Those two places are places I have to go to in times of dire need. If you're having trouble with where you're at in life, if you're having trouble with how you're serving or what's going on in your life, you either need to discover or recover your calling. Discovering your calling is not something that you do automatically. I mean, what you do is you put yourself out there in God's kingdom, and you will kind of have this sense that God is calling you in a certain area. But I'll tell you this, we all have a particular calling, and that is to be telling the word of Christ to other people. And you need to recover that calling in your life. And if you feel like you can't do it, come to me and we'll go through your story and we'll figure out some things that might be keeping you from being able to share God's story in your life. The Christmas is the discovery of a whole new world. That's why Christmas is so big. It's a whole new world. We call it the kingdom of God. And people all around the world at that time, they found different talents they never knew they had. They found passion that was kept quiet. And their hearts erupted and minds expanded. All kinds of breakthroughs and innovations. They found their nerve. They found their courage to set sail themselves. Magellan around the world, all these people taking chances and taking risks because there's a new world. Christmas is about a new world. How much more when we know and believe in the coming of the kingdom of God? How much more can our lives mean? How much more does that expand your nerve? Does that allow you to give risks? Each of you has a calling to His kingdom. Everyone. Hear this. You are valuable to the Lord's kingdom. He's calling you today.